Participants will know what legislation is being introduced in state houses across the country that will make schools less safe, inclusive, and equitable places for LGBTQ plus students. Understand where this anti-LGBTQ plus legislation is coming from and why it is so prolific right now. Believe that schools should be safe, inclusive, and equitable places for LGBTQ plus students. Know how to find out what legislation is being introduced in their state, who their state legislators are, and how to find their contact information. And then they will understand what is and is not effective when communicating with state legislators.
If you're here tonight, we know it's because you're like everyone at school, and like our expert guests, you believe every child should have safe, inclusive schools that prepare them for the future. And if you're here tonight, it's probably because you've seen the uptick in anti-LGBTQ plus legislation in state houses around the country that are causing real harm to our LGBTQ students and want to know what to do. So our guest tonight will talk about what's happening, why, and how we can help support LGBTQ students. So we're going to start by talking to Timon about the scale of the problem because it's truly staggering. The American Civil Liberties Union is mapping the anti-LGBTQ plus legislation being introduced around the country. We're going to chat in a link to that now. But as it says at that link, the ACLU is currently tracking a record 491 anti-LGBTQ plus bills that have been introduced in state legislatures, and that's just in 2023 alone, and we're not even halfway through the year yet. So these bills include such policies as banning gender-affirming care, censoring school curriculum, including book bans, and banning transgender students from playing school sports. Timon, can you describe this legislation? What are some of the major themes that you're seeing across these pieces of legislation that are common?
I think when you look at the number in comparison to, I think it was 100 and something such bills that related to sort of education in schools last year for the full year, and then 491 for this year already. It sort of highlights the reality that there's probably something really strategic about this, and that it's not really even about trans kids. It's about the ability to identify a scapegoat, our very vulnerable community, people that can't necessarily speak for themselves. And so that's why we've seen this kind of wave of anti-LGBTQ legislation, and more specifically targeting trans and gender non-binary young people. I think what's also really interesting and perhaps even dangerous about this is the idea of legislating how parents get to make decisions about their kids, right? And it's not just like we're going to respect parents' rights and parents can decide what their kids can read or how their kids identify. It's saying if your kids don't identify in this way, if they want to read this kind of thing, then that's not allowed. And I think that we should be really alarmed, because I think there's a slippery slope into other areas of civil liberties, of decisions that parents make about their kids. But this is really a telltale for. But I think in part it's because this is a vulnerable community. And some people see it as a way, especially around just concepts of gender that, we didn't quite learn well. To be honest, like I've learned so much more about gender and gender identity, understanding it as different than the category of biological sex, and understanding the components out there that sort of lead to young people coming into early understanding of who they are. I think it's also worth mentioning that I think the people that are promoting and passing this legislation, quite honestly, have done a really good job of like weaponizing ignorance around gender affirming care, for example. Kids are not being mutilated on tables in children's hospitals. But you hear this rhetoric over and again, and it's the most egregious, most invalid stuff that's used to sort of raise fear and anxiety in people. I think the other dangerous thing about it is it ignores the experiences and expertise of medical practitioners, of educators that have worked with trans and non-binary kids. And so there's also this wave of like, even if we know things are not that way, we're still going to promote a particular messaging around it. And I think, again, lots of other areas are vulnerable to that same kind of, promotion of just ignorance about different topics and attitudes.
Yeah, I agree. I know you and I talked a little bit about the different areas of the country that are sometimes stereotyped, because people may think that this is where anti-LGBTQ legislation is being passed. And, if it's 491 bills, how many states are we talking about here? Like, what are the areas of the country that are introduced or passed this kind of legislation?
Well, I would say introduced in all, right? Like, obviously, there's certain states that are less vulnerable to them going as far or getting passed. And it's important to note that many of these bills have actually already passed. I spent about half of my time in Georgia because the LGBTQ Institute is housed at the National Center for Civil Human Rights, and I lead that work across primarily the South, the 14 southern states. All of those states have introduced this kind of legislation. In most of those states, it's already passed. I think it's important not to see the LGBTQ issues as disconnected from the Stop Woke work, the anti-DEI trends that we're seeing right now, where literally you would think that like diversity, equity, inclusion are good things. And now it's like a swear word in some places that like, oh, like, are we saying we don't want diversity and inclusion? Is that why we're trying to get rid of these departments and offices? It's a little bit scary to consider that that's the way that a lot of things are going. But I think it's important for people who are for equity on all of these different issues to really mobilize. I think they've also done a really good job of weaponizing these issues against each other, right? So that like you have people that are concerned about the banning of like different ethnic curriculum or, racial equity curriculum, but then the LGBTQ group is over here. And I think what really needs to happen is sort of, and the efforts that I make is like, how can we create conversations between people that are being affected by book censorship and curriculum banning in all these places? How can we connect women who are concerned about bodily autonomy and to understand that like what a kid or even an adult does with their body is an issue of bodily autonomy, not just the abortion thing, but like how can we see the connections between this? I think it's the state of Oklahoma that proposed that the age of people being able to have access to gender affirming care had even been pushed up into adulthood, like 24, 25 years old, which to me was really saying like, this is not really about even kids. You don't want people not to be binary. Like the only genders you want to recognize are like binary genders. And actually, if you could have no one that did that, you would prefer to see that. So I think it's important to see the connections then between these movements. And I think if people can build coalitions around these efforts and see the intersection of that, it's really important. One important stat that I would also bring up too is that of the increase in suicidality and depression that we're seeing among LGBTQ youth, and particularly trans and non-binary youth, it's trans and non-binary youth of color whose suicidality rates have increased the most. And so I think it's really important that when we're having these conversations, that our most vulnerable populations are really the ones at risk. And as I said, I think on in a thread in a comment, someone had just suggested, which I thought was just really awful, that, well, people in Florida should just leave. And I was like, that's a luxury most people can't afford, to just pick up and leave and go to a state that might be more progressive, right? So that's really short-sighted. People should be able to live wherever they want and still feel like their kids are going to be protected and affirmed and have the access to a quality education.
As I mentioned earlier, this is a record year for anti-LGBTQ plus legislation, a record everyone on this call would rather not. These policies seem so coordinated, and they, you mentioned that they seem very connected. They have sprung up really quickly, the some of us. Could you talk a bit about where this coordination is coming from? Why now? Why have they chosen this moment to weaponize policy like this?
Oh, yes. This particular moment, I think it's ahead of elections, right? How can we galvanize people around a particular issue? How can we find, like, it's interesting, and we hear this a lot, like the resoundingly most immediate threat to kids in school and their livelihood is probably guns right now. But it's a little bit easier to pick on trans and non-binary kids than to pick on the NRA. Disagree with that. I'd love to take the NRA on some of this stuff, but I think it's for some people it's low-hanging fruit, right? And I think that's
It goes back to the
why
scapegoat idea.
Particular moment. Yeah, that's why it's happening at this particular moment, because if we can generate interest around that, I also don't think it's unrelated to, I was reading today about the Southern Baptist Convention, like, and like women ministers, women are being ministers, right? Why weren't we having these conversations even 2-3 years ago? Like, there's something about the moment right now where we're seeing this sort of fallback into like ideas around equity that we hadn't even really seen in a while. I think they've always been there, to be clear, but I think there's something about this particular moment ahead of an election, after a January 6th, after a lot of other things, where people are sort of trying to find, like, what can we hang on to that can sort of generate some interest. And I think it's really strategic on the part of people that are against LGBTQ equity.
Thank you, Tim. Now, that conversation gives us a great understanding of what's happening nationwide, where this legislation is coming from and why. So we're going to take it from the big picture to a state house and hear from Lisa and Representative Baker about how all this is playing out in the Ohio State House.
Thank you. Yes. So thank you, Maya and Tim, and for laying that great landscape for us. So we asked Representative Baker to join us. She is a representative in the Ohio State House, but like Tim just talked about, these bills are happening everywhere. So we're using Ohio as an example of kind of state houses across the country and what we're seeing. Because like Tim just explained, we're seeing these bills that we call copycat bills, right? That are the similar language, these similar themes are coming up over and over. And that's because, this is a coordinated movement. And so we're really excited to hear from Representative Baker about her experience. So Representative Baker, we know you are currently in the Ohio State House, but you also ran for your local school board in an election where extremist candidates ended up winning and actually taking over your local school board. And so you are very well versed in local education policy as well. And we think this is really important that people know what policy can be impacted at the federal level, what the state house can do, and also what power their local school boards have. We say often at School Board School that it's important not just to know what you're advocating for, but who to advocate to. That's how you're effective. If you go to your local school board about something and it's actually the state reps then you're not an effective advocate. And so before we dive into your work at the State House, can you give us just a quick high-level primer for what policy can be impacted at the federal, the state, and the local levels?
Sure. And thanks so much for having me here today. I think our very best case scenario would be that we had some that the federal government passed something like the Equity Act, something that would, on a federal level, prevent discrimination against LGBTQ plus community and would kind of negate some of what's happening on the state level. There's been people pushing that for years, but until, we have the right people there that are willing to push this and able to push this, it's really going to, at this point, be at the state level. So state level right now, we're looking at a lot of bills, and I can talk about that. But the state level, a lot of things at the school up until now, Ohio has really been a local control kind of place where we like to put a lot of the decisions in the local school boards, because you're the ones, who know the area and know the students, know the teachers, know the staff, know the parents are involved. And so we like people involved to decide about their education. But right now in the General Assembly in Ohio, we are definitely seeing seeing the State House try to take kind of a stance on some of the things happening at local school boards.
Yeah, I think that's really an important thing to point out, right? The reason we have local school boards is because we had this value around local control that we're now seeing the state taking over. And I think one of the really important things to know too is that even if you are in a school district like the one I live in, Cincinnati Public Schools, we passed one of the first equity policies in the country, but state law trumps local. And so if the State House passes some of these anti-DEI bills, our local equity policy, we couldn't enforce without the risk of being sued. And so it's really important for everyone on this call to understand kind of who gets to control what and what, policy trumps other policy. So with that really helpful context, we'd like to dive in a little bit more into what's happening at the Ohio State House as a case study again for what's happening across the country. So could you describe some of the anti-LGBTQ plus bills that are in Ohio State House now?
Absolutely. And in all transparency, I was very excited about today and to get to come talk to you. And when I prepared my notes, I was really in a different place mentally than I am right now. I just literally 2 minutes before this started, walked in from driving home from Columbus, sitting in my first committee that has passed now a few hours ago, one of these really discriminatory and horrible bills. So while I prepared things weeks ago, I didn't have the emotion that I have today. So I'm going to try to hold it together and present what I plan to present. But this is a difficult day for people who are advocates of LGBTQ communities in Ohio, and I acknowledge that. And we will continue working. But exactly what Tim said at the beginning is that these are the same bills and a lot of the same legislation we're seeing at multiple states. So it's really important to put that into context and to remember that this is a concerted, coordinated effort that's happening, and to really look at why it's happening and to make sure that we're all involved, even if this isn't the one little area, vulnerable population that's important, that's top priority for us. It's important that we all look at this, because what's happening is really taking away rights of people, and that's a troubling place to go. So I can tell you about the legislation that's been introduced so far at the Ohio House. So the ones that are seeing the most, I'll kind of tell you about the few that are seeing the most traction at this point. House Bill 6, which is officially called the Save Women's Sports Act. I call it the Anti-Trans Athletes Act, would exclude transgender women from the ability to participate in women's sports from all high schools, state institutes of higher education, and private colleges. It has passed committee and is going to the floor. It didn't come today, so luckily we didn't have to vote on that also, but it will be coming soon. House Bill 8, which is referred to as the Parents' Bill of Rights, requires that school districts notify a student's parent of any kind of mental health, emotional, physical, any kind of conversations that students are having at school with counselors, with teachers. So it would explicitly require school staff to disclose to a parent if their student has said anything about gender identity. It also would prohibit lesson plans that contain sexually explicit content, which includes anything with pronouns or sexual orientation. So really would just not allow any discussion of identity or anything. And that has also passed out of committee and will be coming to the House. It was supposed to be voted on today, and one of the sponsors was sick and not at committee, so it should be there next week. Or I'm sorry, at session. And then the other one I'll tell you about is House Bill 68, which is also ironically named Save Adolescents from Experimentation Act. And this is a total ban on gender affirming care for minors in Ohio. It prohibits providers from aiding and abetting. So any discussion about any kind of treatment that would be available in other states is illegal. And it is for anyone under 18 years old. And that passed out of committee today as well. So that will also maybe be coming to the floor soon. So, you know, the irony of all of this passing in Pride Month, and just the, you know, seeing the people in the rooms that are just packed with advocates and supporters and families and kids. It's heartbreaking. We also, do I have time to do a couple that are on the way up? Okay, yeah. We have a couple coming that haven't made it to committee yet. We have House Bill 183, which will require K through 12 and college students in Ohio to use the bathrooms of their sex at birth. And then Senate Bill 83, which is also House Bill 151, is Ohio Higher Education Enhancement Act. Yep. And that has lots of really broad language, which will not allow any courses of study on queer issues, no presentations, training, course materials on LGBT issues or concerns in college, no extracurricular groups for LGBTQ students, no controversial beliefs or policies could be discussed in college. And so that one has also passed out of committee and is coming to the floor. So a lot coming. I will say that there are some things being introduced or have been introduced: the Ohio Fairness Act, the Anti-Conversion Therapy Act, Anti-Bullying Act, and designating Pride Month in Ohio, that have all been either dropped or soon to be dropped, but have not been taken up to be heard yet.
So I think we're hearing, yes, that was a lot. And I think in our last section with Maya and Tim, Maya asked everybody on the call to look up where their what legislation's happening in their state. And the reason we wanted you to do that, and the reason the link's in your handout, is because Representative Baker just went through a whole bunch of legislation in Ohio. But what you heard from Tim right before that was, again, this is coordinated. So when you go into your state legislature, you will see, just like Representative Baker said, these themes around anti-trans bill, parental rights, and as Tim said, whose parents? Not me, I'm a parent. That wasn't me that was represented there, right? So that's another one, the curriculum. So really attacking what can even be discussed in a classroom or read by children, and the gender affirming care. So those are really the themes. And as you saw, Representative Baker is dealing with this every day, and that those are likely being introduced in your state house as well. And so I think one of the things we'd love to hear next from you is, you know, I know everyone on this call really wants to know, well, then what do we do, right? And that not every state house is set up exactly the same, but there are some kind of general structures in place at most state houses, through most state legislatures. So can you tell us a little bit about what's the general process that a bill goes through? And most importantly, where are some of the key places where we can use our voice?
Yes, this is a great question. So generally, sponsors will take the bill and introduce it. And that's when you'll see it on the ohiohouse.gov. This is for Ohio, but ohiohouse.gov website. And you'll be able to follow the bill. The Ohio website, also up at the top right-hand corner, you can request to get notifications when that bill moves. So you can get, you know, you don't have to keep checking the site. It'll either email you or however you enter in. It'll give you notifications when the bill is moving through the process. So the first step is the bill gets assigned to a committee, and that's where the bill is heard. And it has at least 3 hearings. So the sponsors talk first about why they're doing this, and the committee members can ask questions. Then typically there's proponent testimony. So anyone who's in favor of that can come. I would say what's really been surprising to me is the limits put on that. So it seemed I didn't expect this coming into the State House, but we have like 5-minute limits for people to talk. They'll be in the middle of a sentence and they're done. We can ask questions, but sometimes once they answer, we ask for a follow-up to finish, and we're told, no, that was our question. So it's really hard to get into complicated conversations and to have really deep conversations when you're allowed a quick interaction. but we do have the ability to ask questions. And then the third is the opponent testimony. So that's the third day, and people can come in, the same process. And then sometimes it's voted that day. Sometimes there'll be more hearings. It's really at the discretion of the chair. And so there's a lot that one person has control over how much we're hearing. Today, we heard the gender affirming care bill's last day of testimony, and the room was packed. There was an overflow room. There were people in the halls. We had lots of testimony, and we had, I think we said 2 hours to hear it. We got through maybe half of the people who wanted to speak. And it was heartbreaking to me that there was a transgender girl who had been coming. She had come to all four and sat in the front row seat. She was a 10-year-old girl and really wanted to testify. And I saw her testimony because we get them written ahead of time. So it was up there, but we didn't get to her. And so, just not being able to hear from everybody, and we're going to make this huge decision and not hear from everybody is mind-boggling. But so a really great place to add some pressure and to give some feedback is in that committee meeting. Okay. That's the place that really we can work with the bill. Hopefully, if we have people working that will help, consider other things, consider unintended consequences, consider what this really means for the people living this experience. And so definitely, writing in testimony or coming to Columbus and testifying in person are both really helpful things to do. Testimony always has to come in 24 hours before the meeting. And really, it's been an adjustment for me as we heard at the very beginning. My background is in research, and I'm working a hospital system, and I'm used to data and making evidence decisions. Yep. I see that what really moves people is personal stories and emotions way more than data. So at least what I've seen so far. So I would say, being very following the decorum, being non-adversarial, and walking, giving your personal lived experience and what this would mean to you in a really heartfelt and authentic way seems to impact people more than anything else. So that, and then once things get voted yes out of committee, they go to the House, and the House, it is up to the Speaker of the House to decide if it's going to come for a vote or not. So once it gets out of committee, the Speaker of the House is really who I would recommend advocating with and explaining, and especially if it didn't feel like the committee process was fair or people were heard. And, at that point, talking with your own representative that should be voting in the best interest of their constituents is always a good thing to do. I get a lot of notices from my constituents, but sometimes on committees I don't sit on. And so I can't do much until it gets to the floor. So really focusing on committee members first, and then moving to your constituents, for the big floor vote, I'd say.
Okay, those are great tips. So I hope folks were gathering all of those tips together, right? So, like we said, it might be different in your state legislature, but those are the key points. It's going to committee. When it's in committee, really focusing your testimony on the people who are on that committee. And then once it's out of committee, to whoever your representative is, because they're going to all vote on it. And I know you've heard lots of testimony, you've read lots of testimony, that I think that all holds for both at the state level and then even locally. So if some of this is happening at your local school boards, I know again, in Representative Baker's local school district, when those extremists took over, you all are an amazing example of organizing. I mean, her friends and neighbors, that community has gotten so organized, and they show up time and again to school board meetings. People are emailing their board members, they're speaking at the mic. The students have come out and organized, which is amazing to see as well. And so I just wanted to raise up, some of the things that Representative Baker said about, not being adversarial or even aggressive, right? Like we want to model the behavior that we want to see in our elected officials and that we want our students to see. And then one other thing you said, facts are important, but really your personal stories, that's what moves people. And so I don't know if you have any other tips or suggestions for us when people are writing their testimony or giving their testimony that you would also suggest.
I think that is, those are the big things. And yes, you can write in testimony, and we get iPads full of testimony. It's hard to come up to Columbus, and it's hard to tell your personal story, but I will say it's impactful. It's impactful when people's voices break. It's impactful when people are shaking. And, I can read someone's testimony, but when I'm looking in their eyes and they're looking in your eyes, it's hard to ask people to come up to Columbus. But I would say it is a definite impact to have people there. And then, you also can just email or call your own representative's office all the time.
Okay.
So we in Ohio keep logs, at least my office does. I don't know if everyone does. It keeps logs, but I'm able to pull, to say during this, I have 123 emails, against this bill, and I've received 2,643 for this bill. Like, are we representing, it's numbers I can pull up and say this many people are watching. And I think another really important thing, even, in Ohio, we're in a super minority, and it can be really hard when the vote gets to the floor, because it often just falls along party lines. And so I think we need to see incremental wins. And I think that we need to shine light on what's happening and make people uncomfortable, make people have a hard time looking at this room full of people, asking them to do something and do the opposite. And so I think physically showing up, as it's hard to do. It's hard to be in that room. Yeah.
One quick follow-up. I know. One quick follow-up before we wrap up this section, though. Question: there's, sometimes you'll get those like scripted emails or texts, and people will say, send this scripted voicemail, call and leave the scripted voicemail, or send the scripted email. Do those work, or do you have any advice for everyone on this call today about whether or not you should use those?
I mean, I would say if that's all you're able to do, then sure. Like, that will get added to my number of,
okay.
I mean, for this gender affirming care, the numbers were like 120 something and 2,600 something. So you're one of those 2,600, like, that helps me have a big number.
Yeah.
My aide responds to a lot of my emails. I respond to a lot of them, but when it's just a cut and paste thing, it kind of just goes into the number. I mean,
okay.
I think, it does help because it shows that there's more people and there's a lot of people watching. But if you have the time to do something more personalized, like actually submitting to the committee or coming in or making a phone call and like really trying to talk to your representative. And, some people say, why do I call my representative? They vote the way I like. That's fine. I can tell you that I would rather you focus, if you know that I'm on this side, I would rather you work on some of my colleagues. But once in a while, it is nice to have a phone call that says, thank you for doing this. So it goes both ways. But if you only have time for one phone call that person on a committee that's not hearing this and that needs to hear from someone personally. So I would say that if that's all you're able to do, yes, that helps. If you can do that and do something a little more personal, authentic, and as higher up as you can go in the personal, authentic, and in person, and really, being okay with your voice shaking and being scared and nervous. And this is something that's worth speaking out on. So
yeah, and do it anyway. Yes. So as we wrap up this section, we wanted to let everyone on the call know we've got some examples of really compelling testimony in your handout. So a lot of our members of School Board Schools, so those are people who've been through our learning program, they raise their voices and advocate at the state level, and they send in really compelling testimony. And so we wanted to give some examples. So you'll see in the handout, there are a couple examples of great written testimony. There's also a link to a video of a really compelling spoken testimony from a student to a local school board. So we wanted you to see some examples that you could use as you're thinking about submitting testimony yourself. Thank you so much, Representative Baker, for all of that information. We're going to kind of bring all of our guests back into this call because another thing that we say often at School Board School is that we are not learning just to learn. Right? As you all know, because you're on this call tonight, we have some real problems in our communities. And so we are learning to figure out What are the actions we can each take to help solve these problems? So Representative Baker just gave us some really great tips about how to submit compelling testimony, about those scripted emails, about, when you're giving your testimony. And so we're going to spend about the next 15, 20 minutes talking with all of our experts about what else you all can do to support our LGBTQ students. We're going to start with Timim. So Timim, we know you are on the process of writing an op-ed right now. So can you talk to everyone on the call tonight about why you're doing that and why people on this call may consider, like maybe why they should consider submitting op-eds to their local papers?
Yeah, absolutely. I had actually an op-ed published in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. I'm going to try to find it so I can chat it in. But that was certainly like more, it came out, I think, last week. They waited for Pride. It was kind of tokenistic, got me upset, but because I wrote it back in April, I was like, publish it. So we're like, we're going to wait for Pride Month. I was like, oh my goodness. So, but it is really important. The thing I was going to say that also connected to testimony, I'm really glad Rachel shared that, was that, I have not seen the gay agenda. I've been waiting on my copy of the gay agenda. But when a person like myself who identifies as queer gives a testimony, it can sometimes be dismissed as me promoting an agenda. And so for those of you who are straight allies and co-conspirators who really believe in equity from that standpoint, right? It's like, this is just the right thing to do. Your voices are so important in those testimonies because it pushes back against this idea of an agenda of a group of people that are in a group trying to make something happen. And it's saying, no, I just believe ideologically that this is the right thing to do. And that's not to say that like the voices of those of us who identify are not important. I'm not saying that at all, but that there's leverage in someone, who's a heterosexual parent who has kids in school saying, I want my kids to grow up in a school where their friends who might be non-binary and trans feel safe. Like those testimonies are super important. And I think, again, sharing your voices in those spaces are also really important. I think, Moms for Liberty has done a really good job of mobilizing, but I'm seeing some efforts now. Someone chatted in about New Mexico and some of the efforts there. A question I have is, what can we learn from places where they have effectively pushed back against some of these efforts? And how can we sort of share best and promising practices with Ohio that's in the midst of that process right now? What can we learn from a New Mexico or a Minnesota?
That's a great point, Tim. So I want to pick up on two things that you said here. One is we're going to all look up Timim's op-ed, first of all, because an op-ed really is a great way to hit a really large audience. So that's one of the reasons that we would really encourage, if you're interested in writing an op-ed, everybody on this call to draft one and get it submitted to their local newspapers. Again, a number of the people in our School Board School Network have done this. We've had about 8 people get theirs published in the Cincinnati Enquirer now. And in your handout for tonight, we included a link to Bryce Mickey's op-ed. From last year, there was a different anti-trans legislation in front of the Ohio State House, and he just wrote a beautiful, compelling op-ed. And so we wanted to show you that one as an example of an op-ed. And then we included, oh, thank you, and Nona just chatted in the link to it as well. And we gave you some tips for writing compelling op-eds because we know you can do it. I know sometimes this stuff seems like, really? Me? Write an op-ed? And you can. And so definitely check that out. Check out that example one. Check out those tips. But also building off of what Timim said, it's a very difficult time out there right now, right? And so I would love to hear from any or all of you some of these success stories so that people on this call can figure out, is there something that we can potentially learn from and replicate or emulate in our community? So if anyone has a success story to share.
I think that one of the things that I've heard the most in the last, month is very much about showing up, right, and being visible. We see the, right wing be very clear that they want to make LGBTQ people, the idea of pride, toxic, and that will, hopefully change societal attitudes so that they can go after same-sex marriage, they can go after sodomy laws, they can continue to attack bodily autonomy. And they can, shove us back in the closet. And that is really, I think, what's at odds here is that more and more kids are coming out, right? The greatest generation, 1% identified as out LGBTQ people. Gen Z is identifying between 18 to 20% as LGBTQ plus. And that's because we've worked really hard as a community and with our allies to be better represented. Whether it's in media, whether it's in government, right, with elected officials, and whether it is in schools and in our history, and actually teaching the truth of what's happened. And that's what's truly scared them, is because they think they can put this genie back in the bottle. And that's where so much of the legislation that was talked about is coming from. But showing up has been the thing that I, as an LGBTQ person, have just been has buoyed my spirits. While whether it's Starbucks or Target or Bud Light or take your corporation, right, that is being more timid about how they engage this Pride Month, or folks just getting a little too scared. We had a great Pride here in Pittsburgh last weekend, and I was just talking to someone at the gym, and she said, I was just so proud of a place, right, that isn't just Allegheny County or Pittsburgh is. It's part of Ohio, it's West Virginia, it's Western Maryland, right, it's all Western Pennsylvania. And folks showed up, and that really helped showcase that no, we are not scared, that we are here, that we are present. There is a support structure. These people are on the wrong side of history. And that kind of representation allows for kids and allows for all LGBTQ people to know that they can continue to be who they are, or they can be who they are. And that is a struggle that is the hardest struggle I think most of us have ever gone through or will go through. And so showing up, showing your support, even though it's harder, and then encouraging others to do the same, I think right now is really, really important.
That's great. Any other examples of what works, or what you've seen work, or what you've heard in other states or other communities has worked, Representative Baker?
Yeah, I would completely agree with the showing up. When we're in committee and I hear pounding and bullhorns and from outside the window because they've stopped letting people in. We need the committee to hear that. We need that the whole time while they're sitting there. I mean, I think it was a horrible day, but it also was like a beautiful day. It was horrible that people had to be there, but it was beautiful to see how many people were there and how many people were pushing back, and that this isn't the way the majority of people feel. And so absolutely, showing up, being visible, however you can do that, and I think you don't even know who you're showing that to, who you might be helping that day that needed to see more people. And I think the other thing is to be very straightforward about what people are doing. So my daughter is a junior in high school, and we've been looking at colleges and had a college tour in Tennessee, University of Tennessee. And she went and canceled her tour. And in the comments, she wrote, I will not go to a state that has such anti-LGBTQ legislation. And I'm like, have you looked at our own state? But we'll go back to that. But, she's happy because she wants to go out of state. And I used to say no, but now I'm saying, well, I'll pay out of state. But no, we're going to fix it in Ohio. But I think that people need to tell people, and whether anyone saw her message or anyone cared, if people can get enough of this, if corporations, if businesses, if colleges, if states really hear from people who might not be in the community, but are allies and are saying, I don't want to spend time in your state. I don't want to spend my money there. I think we have to do that loudly. And I think it would have been easy for her to cancel hers, but I wanted her to, but I'm so proud that she canceled it and told them why. And she didn't hear anything back, but somebody read it somewhere, and we don't know the butterfly effect of that. So I think being very clear about what this does.
Great example.
Yeah, I think also something that really struck me, and that is really important in the idea of testimonies, is sort of there's a guy named David Fleischer who has a project called Deep Canvassing, and it's kind of this idea that you, like, when you're engaging, I saw that someone was mentioning that they're canvassing, there's not an election, but like, what does it mean to have conversations with neighbors, with people around you, and starting with something that you have in common? I try to ask the question. I was doing a welcoming schools presentation in a district that was doing an LGBTQ training because they were pretty against it, right? Which is why they needed it, right? But so I, aware of that, I try to always lead with the question that no one can disagree with, right? And so, it may be a little tricky, but it's like, like, how many of you feel that like you want all the students that you teach in your class to like live, thrive, and be happy? And then like all the hands go up, and then you go, okay, now I got you. Like, that means a trans kid, that means a non-binary kid, that means all the kids, right? So I think we have to be really strategic about like showing the humanity of all kids, right? Somebody mentioned the bathroom bill being like on the slate of the Ohio things. There's been so much research of late about like how many trans and non-binary kids are developing like bladder infections because they're terrified and afraid to use the bathroom. There are real physical health issues that come when kids cannot even feel safe enough to use a bathroom. But I think it's really important that we engage with people that don't necessarily agree. People don't know what they don't know, and the echo chambers can be so wide that people like, oh, I don't know any trans people. So I think we all have in our reach people that could stand to learn a little bit more, for us to share our stories and move people closer to the compassion, as I say at the Center for Civil and Human Rights, that trans and non-binary issues are human rights issues, right? And if we can agree that trans people, that non-binary people are humans, they got rights. You don't have to understand everything about the intricacy of gender to believe that these people deserve rights.
Yep. Yes. And one thing I'm hearing as a common theme here, right, is that we need to show up, and that we need to make sure that our voices are also loud. And so I think one of the things that we wanted to raise up here as well is that we know that as individuals, we can each speak up, and we should each speak up. That's important, but our voices are much louder when we speak up together. I think in terms of, one other question, we want to bring back Sean back into the conversation here too, because at School Board School, and I think we would all agree on this call, diverse representation at all levels of government is so important. And it's not an easy time to be out and an elected official, or to be out and running for elected office. And so, Sean, we would love to hear from you about the work you do at the LGBTQ Victory Fund and Institute to build and support a diverse pipeline of LGBTQ candidates and leaders who can make change as elected officials. So could you tell us a little about your work?
Yeah, absolutely. And this should come as no surprise, but LGBTQ people are severely underrepresented in government, just like most other minorities. Out of the total percentage, 0.2% of all elected officials are out LGBTQ people, and that's about a little less than 1,200. In order to get to parity, right, with 7.2%, which is the current average, and it continues to increase as Gen Z is more of the population, we need to elect over 36,000 more people just to get to that basic level of parity. So we're severely underrepresented, and that, as was mentioned, that's one of the reasons why they're coming for us. We are underrepresented. We are not fully understood as a people. But LGBTQ Victory Fund's been around for 32 years, fighting the fight to help increase that number. The LGBTQ Victory Fund is the political arm. We work to endorse and support LGBTQ candidates who believe in the fundamental right of privacy to get into office. And you've got to have a viable plan to victory. And one of the reasons we have that as a component is there's only so much money in our network to go, and so we need to make sure that those candidates are the ones that we're supporting. But also because we have a C3, the LGBTQ Victory Institute, and they carry out trainings for LGBTQ candidates on how to create those campaign plans, on how to build a plan to win. how to get started, years out before they might want to run, and how to step forward. They also then, after candidates win, support an elected officials network. And there's an international conference every November, December in Washington, D.C. for those folks to strategize to figure out how to have some of the same conversations we're having here, how to fight back and grow our representation. And this year, we're really focused in on making sure school board candidates are winning. Up and down the ballot, we've got a school board fund as part of our federal PAC. And any school board candidate that we're endorsing, we're giving money to if we legally can, and then giving them that consulting and guidance. And so would love your help to identify even more of those candidates, not only who are running this year, but who are interested in running down the line, get them to a training, get them supported.
That is amazing. So I know Nona just texted in some links for you all. So, everybody on this call, if you know LGBTQ school board candidates, get them those links so they can get in touch with Sean's team. Sean, one more thing we'd love to hear a little bit more from you about is, we think there's a direct link between supporting LGBTQ candidates and elected officials and supporting LGBTQ students. And so how can we, all the people on this call right now, best support LGBTQ elected officials and candidates?
Yeah, we say representation matters, and it really does. Whether a candidate wins or loses, we hear stories all the time of candidates knocking a door and talking to a kid who said, your mailer or reading the article about how you're an out candidate inspired me to come out or start the process of coming out. And so helping, financially, helping whether it's door knocking, helping make sure that those folks get the phone calls they needed to the voters they need is really important. And you can see all of our candidates on victoryfund.org. And then also making sure that LGBTQ elected officials are connected to our network, right? There's a lot of trauma that we share, and there's a lot of problems that we're all collectively facing. And so one link that I'll push is outforamerica.org. This is all of the currently identified out LGBTQ people. Please take a look at that map. If there are LGBTQ elected officials missing, and then if there are LGBTQ candidates running, please get in touch with us. Please share that with them because that solidarity, that strategizing is really important at a time like this when they're facing some of the most violent attacks. Our candidates, 67% of our candidates last year faced some sort of anti-LGBTQ attack on them. And so we need to show that these candidates can continue to win if they are prepared and that they've got the support structures because we need to get 36,000 more folks. And we're seeing a little bit of a timidity in some LGBTQ folks. Some people are very excited to step forward. But really what we're seeing a timidity, sadly, is kind of in the allies or supposed allies, the people who are recruiting candidates. I talked to someone in central Pennsylvania, and they were very, worried about getting an LGBTQ person to run on their school board slate because they didn't want these issues to be, part of it, right? And that comes more from ignorance than anything. That candidate ended up running, they ended up winning in their primary. We're going to make sure that they win their general election. But that's something else. Having those conversations with the stakeholders who are recruiting candidates for state legislature, who are recruiting candidates for school board, because we can authentically speak to this impact. We can tell those stories directly, and that representation is indeed power.
That's fantastic. Thank you. We would love to hear from our three expert guests. Maybe if they just take 1 minute each at the end here, because we know that you each play these really important roles from different perspectives, from government, from nonprofit, from campaigns. And so we would love to hear from each of you. If you could get everyone on this call to take one action to support LGBTQ kids and students, what would it be? What's the one thing you wish we would all do? And if you each give us one, then we get 3 options. So whoever would like to start, just taking 1 minute and giving us an action to do.
I have a start.
Mm-hmm.
I think that I really love what someone, I forget if it was Sean or Tim, said about relationships and being very authentic. And my one ask would be to think of one person in your life that you respect and have a good relationship with, and you've never talked about these issues with. and have the conversation. Because, you know, I think it's very easy and it's a privilege to not have to have these conversations. And if we can, you know, I found in my canvassing and if I can just look someone in the eyes, talk to them and really understand each other, not talk to them to convince them, but talk to them to really understand their viewpoint. And I would bet in a lot of cases, you'll connect on this. And if not, hopefully you'll open someone's eyes. So I would ask everyone to think of one person in their life that they could talk about this. You could use it as tonight, you know, talk about what you're thinking about LGBTQ discrimination in our state.
It's a great tip.
I'd say the one thing that I will mention was kind of prompted in the someone mentioned about coalition building across different groups. I forget which of the state bills it was, but it was one, I think it was curriculum based, and it did combine this whole divisive concepts in such a way that it would impact students of color and LGBTQ students at the same time. And I felt like this was a real opportunity for the Urban League, for the NAACP, for Listen, for HRC, for all these organizations to come together, for the leadership of these organizations to come together and say, this is going to impact all of us. We may have very particular lenses around what we find most important, but if we come together on a united front, that those coalitions can be so important. So kind of what I said in the chat, right? We advocate most easily for the things that directly impact us. Show up at a meeting where you're not expected to be there because it doesn't directly impact you, right? I don't mind being the only person at a Stop Asian Hate meeting because I want them to see me there and to see that, like, I think this is important, right? And I think if more of us did that around like our basic humanity, what we all want to fight for, that we could, I think, you know, there are people that are afraid of these coalitions forming where people are coming together across certain lines of difference, because I think ultimately, I believe, and maybe I'm an idealist, I think there are more good-hearted, good people in the world than there are evil folks.
Yeah, that's a very good action, Tim, and thank you for that one as well. Sean.
I would say go to victoryfund.org and donate, or go, you know, or go volunteer. And then also just remember one statistic. One thing that we see really sadly working for a lot of folks, even Democrats, is the talking point that like men shouldn't compete in women's sports, right? But you know, if you just remember that Leah Thomas is the one that is most cited for NCAA. She placed first in a swim meet for the 500 yards. But if she was so advantaged, then why did she place fifth in the 200 yards? And why did she place eighth in the 100 yards? Right. And I just used that on you know, on my brother's friends, right? Who said, oh, I just don't think that, you know, and he was like, oh, wait. And that just gets people thinking and say, hey, maybe you should look a little bit more into this. And so just remember that, because that's where we're sadly seeing some of our base constituencies weaken.